Welcome to Cafe with Cavanha. It's a pleasure to have Professor Dale Rogers, Professor of Business at Arizona State University. We invited him to talk about supply chain indicators, looking economy ahead. Good morning, Professor Dale.
Good morning. It's great to be with you.
It's a pleasure for me. You said via Fortune that GDP looks what already happened. Some logistic indicators can tell us what's going to happen. Could you please bring this concept to us?
Sure, absolutely. And I think it's an important idea, truthfully, because way too many people think that the economy is basically the same thing as GDP. Economists like using GDP because it measures economic activity once instead of multiple times, and it measures it right as it's going to the consumer. So from the retailer to the consumer, or from some service provider to the consumer, that's where you measure GDP. And the truth is that that's a small fraction of what the economy really is. And GDP only tells you what's already happened throughout the supply chain, because none of those transactions are accounted for except the one right at the end. And for example, I think this past year, Brazilian GDP was just over $2 trillion. It's about a tenth of the size of US GDP, but really the Brazilian economy is much, much larger than $2 trillion because of all the business to business activity upstream in the supply chain. And so you actually see changes in the economy if you're measuring upstream activity versus only GDP. I hope that makes sense. There's several indicators, including one that we do here with a few faculty from around the U.S., many of them who are not originally Americans. Rutgers University, Shen Yenyurt, and who's from Romania and Turkey, and Rudy Leuschner, who's from Germany, and Ron Lemke from Nevada, who is American, and Stephen Carnevale. And then, of course, Dr. Zach Rogers, who is my oldest son at Colorado State, and he works on it as well. And, if you look at the LMI, the Logistics Managers Index, you see movement in the economy much earlier than if you just look at GDP.
And how long can you see in front?
Well, you can see more than a year in advance of what's going to happen in GDP, because you can already tell, a year early, particularly if you look at the logistics components. And I would, by the way, I could share with your viewers the most recent Logistics Managers Index and go through it a little bit if you're interested, because it is really kind of a very interesting description of what's happening in the economy. Let me I can share my screen, right? Let me share my screen here, and I will show you. Can you see that?
Yes.
Graph in the middle? So that is the Logistics Managers Index, which measures three components in a bunch of different ways. So the components are inventories, warehousing, utilization, capacity, and so on, and then transportation, pricing, and capacity and utilization. So we measured those three things, but in a bunch of different ways for the current period, and then also a future in 12 months. Have folks guess about that, and we're just finishing up the December LMI, which isn't out yet. It'll be out on Tuesday. If any of your viewers are interested, they can go to the website the-lmi.com, and they can see the results. And we cooperate with ILOS from Rio, Cesar, and those guys, Cesar, Lavalle, and those guys on the LMI as well. And we've been talking for years about doing one for Brazil. I think that'll probably happen this year. But you can look at this graph and you can see that the sort of weighted average of warehousing, inventory, and transportation has been growing in the U.S. Since before September 2017, which is the first month we have here on this graph. It's a rate of change index, which means we ask people to say, is the economy that they're seeing in these three areas, inventory, our inventory holdings increasing, staying the same, or are they declining? Transportation capacity decreasing, staying the same, increasing. Transportation prices, the same thing. Then we average those things together and we come up with this index. And you can see, if I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but
yes.
You can see over from the beginning of this past year, where it goes from 0 to 100. So 100 would be growing. Everybody says it's growing. 0 would be everybody says it's declining. 50 would be it's staying the same. And you can see a decline in growth over the last year, and then a little bit of an upward curve, except October was the lowest we've seen. So what this is predicting is, and what it's saying is, that upstream supply chain activity, even though the consumer economy in the U.S. is very hot. You hear Trump talking about this all the time, about the great economy. The stock market is good. But upstream, we're seeing changes there. And we're seeing a decline upstream. This usually means that there's some sort of recession or some sort of decline in business that's coming. What's early evidence of that? Well, one bit of early evidence is FedEx and their earnings. And I don't know if any of your viewers are following this, but FedEx has seen their earnings decline substantially the last 2 quarters. They've missed on their quarterly estimates, both for the quarter ending in September and then the most recent quarter ending in December. And there's a lot of consternation about this because FedEx is an important part of that upstream economy. And the U.S. Business has been really slow for FedEx, and they've had to build new infrastructure to handle e-commerce stuff and so on. But we're seeing a really interesting thing happen. Does this say for sure there's going to be a recession coming? It does not, but it says there's troubling things happening upstream in the economy when GDP seems absolutely fine. So that's what I meant. That's a very long explanation. That's what I meant when I said GDP tells you what's happened already. These logistics indicators, including to some extent, cavanha, like FedEx's earnings or UPS's earnings, those show what's actually happening and is an early indicator, an early warning sign, versus the consumer economy, which is really a lagging indicator, which says here's what already happened.
DHL and USPS are included in this index too?
Well, we don't just have FedEx and UPS. We have anybody that works in logistics in the U.S. So it can include, there are people in the survey from the post office, USPS, from DHL, but also from Kuehne + Nagel, Intel, On Semiconductor, Procter & Gamble, Unilever, Coca-Cola. All those companies are part of this index.
And do you have this index for by country? I mean, only for the United States, or you have other countries?
Well, we'd love to do it. If we do another one, the first one we'll do is Brazil, and I got to talk our mutual friend Cesar into pushing it through. But ILOS has said that they're interested in doing it. But yeah, right now the only place we're doing it is in Brazil. We're also talking about China as well.
Excellent. Could be a good idea to see China evolution.
Yeah.
You have the numbers for China?
No, I don't have it for China, just for the U.S. But here's the component. So here's inventory levels. So you can see that people going into the companies going into the fourth quarter in the U.S., when typically you'd expect to see inventories increasing, you can see them bleeding down their inventories. So inventory is not really growing. You can see.
What does it mean? Dale, what does it mean? The number 54.3 is the capacity.
Okay, so what that means is inventory is barely growing. So it's a 0 to 100 scale. 100 is everybody that responds to the index says it's growing. 0 would be everybody says it's declining. 50 would be it saying it's staying the same. So the level of growth is at its lowest level since we've been doing the index in late 2017.
So we could include the link for the website in the video later when I make the.
Sure, absolutely. Here's inventory cost, follows the same trajectory. Here's warehousing capacity, which this is an interesting one because that one's going up, but how come it's going up? Well, warehousing capacity has been really tight here in the U.S. for the last few years. It's hard to find empty warehouses because the economy is so hot. We're also changing the model as we add more facilities in a distribution network as we move to e-commerce. And so the fact that all of a sudden it feels like there's a growth in warehousing capacity when not a lot of new warehouses are being built, what's really happening is there's less need. Now, it says it's growing. Here's warehouse utilization, which has been very high and has declined a little bit. And then warehousing prices, which started to really come down last spring. And, there's a cyclicality to them. Fourth quarter, they tend to be the highest. Fourth quarter is, October, November, December. And so there's been a fair amount of growth recently in warehousing prices, but still we've seen a decline over the highest levels a year and 2 years ago. This one's really interesting. Transportation capacity, which was growing, and then, like everything else in this index, has started to cool down. Here's utilization of transportation, which you would expect to spike up in the fourth quarter, and has not really increased. It's at its second to lowest level. Its lowest level was this past summer in June, but November was also relatively low, which is unusual for the fourth quarter. And then this is the one that I think is the main indicator of all this stuff. This is really interesting, Cavanha. This is transportation prices. And transportation prices, almost everybody, you can see back here in early 2018, almost everybody was feeling like the carriers were dramatically increasing prices. And look at what's happened. So this is an indicator of what's happening in the economy right now versus GDP, which tells you what happened at the end. And we've seen a decay in transportation prices. Transportation prices are coming down. A good example of that is what we were talking about already with FedEx's numbers coming down. So it's really very interesting to see this one, I think. And transportation prices tend to be very responsive to changes in the upstream economy, which is what we're seeing. To go a little bit farther on this, we cooperate. There's a company called FreightWaves, which is sort of a logistics data repository, sort of a new kind of firm. We didn't have these kind of things 5 or 10 years ago, really. And FreightWaves measures a bunch of things around logistics components as well. One of the things they measure is tender rejects, which sounds like it's something different than what it is. But what it means is when you tender a load, when you offer a load to a carrier, how often do they reject it and say, "I'm sorry, I'm full, I can't take any more freight"? A year ago, 2 years ago, tender rejects were very high. In the last year, they've come down substantially, very similarly to this transportation price index, as there's been a real decay in the amount of stuff being put on trucks and planes and trains here in the U.S. because the upstream supply chain economy has cooled has cooled down. So I think it's a really interesting change, and not something that a lot of economists are paying as much attention to as they probably should.
But Dale, with the increasing of e-commerce, and probably we are, growing the storage or decreasing the storage, and does have influence in this index? I mean, for the e-commerce growing?
Yeah, it does. It should actually show. I mean, just with the rise in e-commerce, you'd expect warehousing to be growing faster than it is. You'd expect more transportation. Instead of the consumer doing a lot of the transportation, certainly all of the last mile of transportation themselves. Now Amazon and FedEx and so on bring the item to our house, to a house, and it's just been it's surprising what we've seen actually.
That's great.
I actually would love to show you something else too that I think is related to this, that I would guess that most of your viewers have not gotten to see. Let me share another slide with you.
Sure.
Can you see this?
Yes.
This slide. This comes from FedEx's earnings call. You know, I'm sort of a nerd that listens to corporate earnings calls sometimes, and I really like listening to the carrier ones. And Fred Smith, who does, you know, he's the main guy at FedEx. He really is a brilliant man, and so I like to hear what he has to say. This really shows changes in e-commerce. So the left scale is percentage, and then the horizontal, the x-axis, is date starting beginning of 2017. And I think this is so interesting because, and I don't know if your viewers can see this, but this line right here, that is, it's blue, and that's the United States Postal Service. And then this line down here, the purple one is FedEx. And UPS is this sort of maroonish one. And then look at Amazon Logistics. So what this says is, and of course FedEx has stopped carrying packages for Amazon. They were really frustrated with them, and they pulled the plug this summer. FedEx never really carried that much stuff for Amazon. The other line, the sort of grayish line, is other carriers, some regional ones like OnTrack and so on. UPS was at 20% in January of 2017. They're now at about, what would that be?
Flat.
16, something like that, 16, 17% of Amazon's shipments. Now, the volume has grown since 2017, but the carrier share for UPS has declined. USPS, the Postal Service, had almost 60% in January of 2017, and then going into this summer, and it's continued to decline, it's a little over 30%. So the post office has lost about half of the percentage of Amazon. And then look at Amazon Logistics. January 2017, 16, 17% over here, and an incredible increase now, to where going into the summer, 50. Almost 50, and by now it's above 50. Wow. I don't have the most current data, but now it's above 50, and you can kind of see what's likely to happen in other countries, such as Brazil with Amazon. You can see, what does Amazon think about Brazil? Well, they think that the last mile carriers are not that strong in Brazil, and that they need to figure out how to do some of that themselves. So in countries like Brazil and China and, you know, countries in Europe, you're going to see Amazon Logistics take a much bigger share of that email less commerce. And Amazon is planning on, I think, not just caring for themselves, but for whoever will be willing to put their stuff on Amazon Logistics. They're going to be like a UPS, a DHL, a FedEx. They really already are in the US, but you're going to see that happen in places like Brazil as well.
Very interesting picture, this one.
Yeah. I think it's a fascinating time of tremendous change right now, and a very unpredictable, tentative economy that's uncomfortable for a lot of people. As you and I talked a few months ago about deglobalization, and you can't really deglobalize but we sure are seeing efforts to do that.
Someone needs to talk to Trump that we can have a recession very soon, huh?
Well, I'm wondering, I think there is a recession coming. Will it be before or after the 2020 election?
Wow.
And it could be after. But if it's before, it could be the end of Trump. And of course, a lot of us in the US are not sure we can live through another 4 years of this craziness. Isn't it interesting that the US, which we've always been a relatively stable place, not always doing the right things, but stable, we've deliberately chosen chaos. And Trump is definitely not a traditional American president, and for many of us, it's a very uncomfortable thing to have him be president.
Excellent. We appreciate this conversation with Professor Dale Rogers, and please do not forget to send me via tweet the link to include in the video.
Absolutely. I'll do it right now.
Appreciate. Thank you very much.
Great to see you. I always love talking to you. My son, Zach, says to say hello. He always enjoys getting to be with you as well.
It's a pleasure, and have a good 2020 year.
Thank you. Same to you.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye.